Outlaw Law is brought to you by Whitaker and Hamer, attorneys and counselors at law. Your law firm for life.
Welcome back into the Outlaw Lawyers. Josh Whitaker and Joe Hamer, managing partners, Whitaker and Hamer Law Firm, practicing attorneys here in North Carolina. Offices located Raleigh, Garner, Clayton, Goldsboro, Fuquay-Varina, Gastonia, and joining us from the Morehead City office, also an attorney with Whitaker and Hamer, Cassandra Nicholas. It is always legalese. We get into these different discussions. We kind of go off track and have some fun in certain areas, but very serious stuff. If you've got legal situations you're facing, you've got questions, you can always contact Whitaker and Hamer. Call 800-659-1186. That's 800-659-1186. Leave your contact information, briefly what the call's about, and an attorney with Whitaker and Hamer will be in touch. You can always email the show, questions at theoutlawlawyer.com, and we'll answer them on a future program. So, Josh, we're going to go listener questions. Start us off.
Yeah. Our first listener question this week, and I always give this qualification here that these questions, we have permission to share these. We don't identify anybody. We're talking about these in general. We usually change some of the facts, but it gives us a lot of things. It kind of gives us a jumping off point to talk about some things that, I always figure if one person asks this question, then other people have asked similar questions or maybe have similar situations on here. So this question's designed for us to talk about a couple of things today, but I'll go ahead and kind of read it out here, and I've kind of jotted it down and changed it a little bit. But our listener question is basically, I bought a house with a boyfriend. The boyfriend was separated from his wife, right? So we have a single woman, and she's in a relationship with a man who is separated from his wife, and they bought a house together. They're both on the mortgage. They're both on the deed, so they own it. We'll give the woman a name. Let's do Jane. Our boyfriend's name, we're going to go with a good old John. We'll keep it very simple here.
John Katsopoulos.
So Jane and John. John has a wife. We'll call her wife, and they're separated. All right. So Jane and John decide they're going to start a life together. John has gotten separated from his wife, and they don't want to pay rent. They buy a house. They get a mortgage. So they own this house together. And so in this situation, which is very unfortunate, John dies, right? So John passes away, and he passes away before he ever gets divorced from his wife. All right. So that's a very important fact pattern. So John and his wife are separated. They're going to live apart. They're still married. That's what separated means in North Carolina. If you're separated from your spouse, you're still a married person. So they're separated. John and Jane are together. Jane is single. So John is a separated man, and Jane buy a house together, get a mortgage, start a life together. He is still married, albeit separated from his wife. And after they purchase a house, John dies. And so in this situation, our client, or for the purposes of our question, our client is Jane. And the status of the real property, the status of the house, is what's up for debate. And we're going to assume John, just recently being separated, has not changed his will, has not updated anything, doesn't have a will, didn't draft one, was a young man. This was a very unfortunate death. So that's our fact pattern.
What a winding road you just took us on, man. Good Lord.
Does that make
This
sense?
feels like law school.
Man.
I'm about to be cold called. This was not previewed with me.
I have a full beard. I grew a beard during that. That was
okay. I have additional questions about the fact pattern.
That's a lot.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Jane and John purchased the house together. So their names are both on the deed. Does it specify whether they are joint tenants with right of survivorship, or is it just a default to tenants in common?
Right. So that's a good question. And so let's review that with our listeners. When you buy a piece of property, when you buy a piece of real property with another person, if you buy it with your spouse, you can own it. In North Carolina, we call this tenants by the entirety. So if you own a piece of property, your spouse is on the deed. It's obvious from the deed that you're married when you take title to the property. That's a special way you can hold property. They did not, obviously, Jane and John were not married, so they didn't own it as tenants by the entirety. Cassandra's questions was then, there's two other ways you can own property. All right, so you can own it as joint tenants with right of survivorship, which is a great way to own property. If you own property with a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a partner.
It would be the better way for Jane.
it would have helped Jane out here. That is not our fact pattern, Cassandra. No. Our folks did not talk about that with their closing attorney. It didn't come up. It wasn't something they were interested in learning at the time. So they took title as Jane, an unmarried woman, and John, a separated man. So they did not take title as joint tenants with the right of survivorship. They took title as, in North Carolina, the last way you can hold property together is as tenants in common.
I think it's important, and you may have touched on this, but I was recovering from that fact pattern, so I'm in a daze. But I think it's important to note, that's the default legal position in the absence of it being stated, or in the absence of a couple being married, is going to be that tenants in common. That's what it's going to be. So unless you explicitly state, if you're two individuals that are not married to one another, unless you explicitly state that you want to own as joint tenants with right of survivorship, then it's going to default to that tenants in common classification.
And when you have tenants in common, the parties own their separate ownership rights, essentially separately. If either one of them passes, their ownership rights go to their heirs. Follow the standard, whether that's through their will or the default intestacy rules if there is no will.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways in this fact pattern Jane and John could have saved themselves some trouble, right? So if they had taken title...
I do have a follow-up question regarding that. I assume they also were not thinking ahead and did not have wife sign like a free trader agreement to disclaim her rights?
No,
take it easy on Jane. She's lost the love of her life.
No, John and Jane did not get any attorney advice at all during this whole process, and they have just leapt into a situation that in a perfect world wouldn't happen. But no, they do take us tenants in common, and in this situation, John has not updated his will. In North Carolina, separated spouses sometimes enter into a separation agreement where free trader rights are bestowed, basically meaning they can go buy another house and the surviving spouse doesn't have any interest. Because in North Carolina, a spouse has an interest in a lot of things you own unless you take care of it in other ways, right? So the default is, even if you and your spouse can't stand each other, even if you've been separated for 19 years and you've never gotten a divorce, that spouse is still your spouse. You're still a married person, and they're still have rights under the North Carolina statutes that you're not going to be able to get rid of. And so here, it's going to hit us really hard because John did not have a will, and they didn't own the property as joint tenants with right of survivorship. So John's wife is going to inherit. There's no children here, thankfully. Thankfully, there's no children.
Thank goodness.
Because John's passed away. They would have lost their father.
And if I had to deal with the children going through this theoretical loss, man, that would be too much for me.
So now Jane is on a mortgage. She owns 50% of the house, and John's wife owns the other 50% of the house. So they are 50-50.
And you know they get along, man. You know that they're basically best friends, man. Because isn't that how most situations are with the ex-husband, the soon-to-be ex-husband, and the live-in girlfriend that you bought a house with before you got divorced?
I think this is how Laverne and Shirley started.
Yeah.
I think it's or Happy Days. Maybe Happy Days started that way. I can't remember.
I think at the end of the day, we've got some bad news for Jane.
It's not a good consult. No, Jane is 100% responsible for a mortgage on property she is a 50% owner of. And to make this worse, arguably the mortgage company is going to have cause to foreclose.
Man, you just said it, dude. That's it right there. So Jane loses John. Sad.
And
then Jane finds out that she's now. No. She owns the property with John's ex-wife, who she obviously hates because she's a terrible person. Then she has to pay the mortgage solely for the house that John's ex-wife is a co-owner on. It's the triple threat.
So probably what's going to happen is Jane and the wife are probably going to sell this house. I mean, that's probably realistically what's going to happen. Because the wife, I wish I'd given the wife a name now because now she's just wife. But the wife, we've talked about it on the show before, petition to partition. You have two owners to a piece of property. One wants to sell, one doesn't. Well, the one who wants to sell can file a petition to partition and get a judge's order, a court order ordering the other owner to sell. So this property is probably going to get sold whether Jane likes it or not. And Jane's going to have a hard time. She's going to have to start over. That's what Jane's going to have to do. I think she's going to have to start from scratch.
Jane could buy out Wipe's half, but that sucks.
Bummer.
But
Even bigger bummer. Jane doesn't want to give wife any money. Come on.
Let's add to the fact pattern then, Cassandra. Let's say this was a VA loan. They borrowed more than the house was worth, and so there's no equity in the house. It's fully maxed out. So it'd be
well, then Jane's
I don't like
house.
that. That's not as cool. I got a better. If we're gonna put a twist on it, let's say wife killed John, and John's will has a slayer provision in it.
It doesn't have
Yeah, let's get deep on it.
So there's no will.
That's right. Sorry, man. I got lost halfway through your backpack.
Even as the default
I
heir under intestacy rules, the slayer provision, there's a slayer statute, so it doesn't have to be written into your will. You cannot inherit from someone you killed.
I like to put it in there just in case, just to remind the person who's inheriting from me not to murder me. You can never be too safe about that.
That's an important statute that you can't inherit from someone that you've murdered.
But then she needs to be charged and convicted of the murder, because if you just accuse her of murdering John, that's not enough to take away her inheritance.
It's wife, man. Come on. You know wife. You know enough about wife.
Wanda.
She probably did it in a really sneaky way too. Wanda the wife.
Well, hopefully sneaky so that she can inherit half of that house.
Whose side are you on, you monster?
All right, the Outlaw Lawyers, Josh Whitaker and Joe Hamer, Whitaker and Hamer Law Firm, the power behind the program. Offices located Raleigh, Garner, Clayton, Goldsboro, Fuquay, Varina, Gastonia, and Morehead City. And speaking of Morehead City, that's where Cassandra Nicholas is joining us, also an attorney with Whitaker and Hamer. If you've got a legal situation you're facing, you've got questions you need answers to, you can always call the firm, 800-659-1186. That's 800-659-1186. Leave your contact information, briefly what the call is about, and an attorney with Whitaker and Hamer will be in touch. And you can always email questions to the show. That's what we're doing today. We're doing listener questions, and it's questions@theoutlawlawyer.com. Again, questions@theoutlawlawyer.com. We're back right after this.